All right. I'm Michael, and today I'm here with Nate, and we're going to talk about Sergei Bulgakov's Sophiology of Death, um, which is the essay from a larger collection by the same title. That I guess it was just recently translated. I can't. Trying to remember the translator's name.
Roberto de la Naval.
Yeah, super interesting work, and this particular essay has really captured me. And
I
it,
really think I could read that 20 times and still get something new out of every time.
yeah, it,
It's pretty amazing. Like in terms of like a non-full length piece of theological writing, I think it's the most impactful thing I've ever read.
yeah. Um, my first intuition on reading it was like, okay, I'm not I haven't read widely in theology or philosophy for that matter. I've kind of like dabbled, or I've probably engaged even more so with interpreters of various theologians and philosophers. But for me, this was really deep in terms of I'd never seen somebody trying to wrestle with aspects of the Trinity, the incarnation, and the crucifixion all at the same time. I've always seen those things kind of taken on, separately, but he was trying to like take these things that are usually, in my experience anyway, dealt separately and pull them together.
It's interesting too, because I think that like it's one of those things where I think you could have no previous, I think you could come to it and you might be confused by some of the terminology, like
Mhm.
the Bulgakovian terminology if you've never read him before. But I think you'll still get the gist of it. Like I think like what he's trying to drive home, I think you would understand, even if you don't understand what he means by sophiologically or sophionicity or any of those like specific terms that he's using within that do refer to his own kind of like theological system.
Mhm.
So
Agreed. Well, in terms of those terms, I did have one question for you in terms of like, I
sure.
feel like my understanding of specifically the word like hypostasis, or I don't even know if I'm saying that right, that like it's used to refer to the persons of the Trinity, but
Yeah.
um could you my definition of that's kind of fuzzy. What is like, could you just put a finer point on that, like what that word, why it's specifically used instead of person, like what sort of technical ramifications is Bulgakov
Well,
gesturing
person
towards?
is, I mean, that's what's actually used in the Greek of the creeds, is hypostasis, right?
Yeah.
So that's just like, so that's, we usually translate it as person in English. Um, but um, that's, I mean, it's a theologically, like, there's been a lot of ink spilled on it as a theological concept. But that's like, I mean, for the sake of like our audience, like, person, but person understood theologically, which is a very complicated subject,
Mhm.
is what it means.
Okay, gotcha. And another thing, kind of calling back to what you were just saying about how, you know, even for the neophyte, person that doesn't have a background in theology, there's still a lot you can get out of this. A big part of that, I would say, is also the fact that, like, so roughly the first, I don't know, 60-70% of it is a sort of treatise from a kind of sort of, logical, philosophical perspective, uh, tearing apart, these aspects that I was referring to of the Trinity and the incarnation and the cross, and what is the Trinity actually accomplishing through the cross in kind of detailed theological and philosophical language. And then there's this kind of sharp departure from that where he just starts relaying his own personal story, and how that,
Right. Yeah. His own. Yeah.
so he's relaying two kind of near death experiences he's had, and just kind of some of the interesting things. I think he says that coming away from those experiences, he feels like sort of like he's like a herald coming from the precipice of a new world, that he feels like this responsibility to try and kind of steward some of that into this. And I found that really interesting because you don't really see a lot of that. I don't know. Maybe you can think of other examples where that's done. I think, if you go back to like really far back to the ancients, there's a more of a combination of the personal with the theological, but often
Right. Well,
in the,
Augustine is the most obvious example, right?
yeah,
Of that, bringing that personal experience to the way, like that he's doing theology. And I would say it's not just personal, it's actually mystical in this case. I mean, he's recounting of what is are definitely mystical experiences.
yeah.
And um I think like there is I mean there is definitely a tradition of mystics like talking about their mystical experiences and also doing theology within the church. So but it's definitely strange for to see it in a modern
Hmm.
is very unusual because I mean Bulgakov like really obviously just doesn't, I mean he doesn't care about the way modernity views the world at all. Like he doesn't, it's not even a consideration for him. He's not like it's not like he's trying to refute it like
Hmm.
argumentatively. It's just like obviously wrong on the face. I mean he does, I mean there are times when he does like but not a lot. Like mainly it's just like it's so obviously wrong he just like moves on past it and like tries to get to like
Yeah.
what matters.
In terms, it's funny because like, yeah, he in the logical, philosophical, theological part of the argument, it's all, I would say, his base level assumptions, or where his premises are coming. It's all, the kind of the basics of the Trinity and the incarnation. Like, what has the church said about these things, and like,
Yeah.
how do we
That's kind
understand?
of what that's like kind of what Bulgakov does is like he's like, okay, I'm going to take the creeds of the church to be true. And assuming that the creeds of the church are true, how much further can we push this? How much better can we understand this? Which is why I think like, I mean, despite the fact that he, you know, ran afoul of um certain parts of the church hierarchy for his sophiology in his day, like his approach to theology is profoundly orthodox. It's
Yeah.
always rooted in, it's always grounded in assuming the creeds are true and then trying to push the understanding that we have of what the meaning of those things is further.
Hmm. I'm curious what you think, specifically what aspects of, because Sophiology was a term that had been used previously. Was it
Mhm.
always kind of had a sort of like a sort
So
of dark cloud on it in terms of like its,
Sophiology has, you know, is viewed with suspicion because of the like it's mostly okay. So most of the intellectual contributions to Sophiology have come out of the Russian
Mhm,
tradition, right? Like
right?
most of obviously we've talked to Michael Martin and obviously there are a lot of other sociological strains that are like outside that Russian tradition. I'm getting ready to talk to Yosef from the Discord soon, and I think we're going to talk about Margaret Barker's work, but then the more important part of that conversation is going to be we're going to be talking about some of the overlap between Kabbalah and Sophiology, which I think is significant. So it's like it's not like this is actually like it's a tradition that actually has very deep roots, but it like in terms of a systematic theology, it develops in its highest form, like probably I would say Bulgakov in terms of its systematic development is like the highest achievement of its development as a systematic theology. But it does, which is kind of like I think that's like a good thing and a bad thing because it's like at the same time it's like I don't think sociology like ought to be systematic, kind of like by its nature. But it does help to, I mean, but it always helps to have a good understanding of what you mean by things. I hope I answered your question. I feel like I kind of like I didn't directly answer it. Oh, I lost sound for a second.
Oh, sorry, that was my fault.
Okay.
So I guess my question is more like, what is, because it seems like, he's still held up as, a respected Orthodox theologian, but but so I'm curious specifically what their problems were. Like
Well,
what is
the base level critique, which I don't understand how anyone who's read Bulgakov carefully can think this, is that he's creating a fourth
right,
hypostasis
right,
of the
right.
Trinity, but that's not really his position. He's saying that divine Sophia is the ousia that is
Hmm.
shared by all three persons of, like, he's
Yeah,
saying that, like,
yeah,
that's what the ousia is. It is wisdom, glory, it is Sophia. And um and the creaturely Sophia is like that which joins us to that. And that's what the restoration of that creaturely Sophia is part of what's going on in the conquest of death by death.
yeah.
So somehow I think, like, Bulgakov seems to view like a connection. There's a connection between, well, first of all, so Christ's humanity is tied to our humanity, but
Mhm.
also there's a way in which, because he sees this in sociological terms, there's also a way in which, like, humanity is tied to the world soul. We're like, ultimately, like, we're what holds creation together from this side. So within the created realm. So it's like creation is like, we are held in being by God, but there's a way in which we hold the creation in order, which the fall messes with. That's
Yeah,
why it's messed up, because when we fall, it necessarily requires that the creation fall, because it is when we are in our proper creaturely Sophianic mode as humanity, then everything is ordered in its right place.
right. That role of mediator, that role of sort of sub creator.
Correct. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
And so it's interesting because you like it's funny because there's this for me, this idea of sociology just it fills in so many gaps that I see, and it does so in a way that for me, like, it's not systematic, like you pointed out. It's a sort of
Well, it can be. I mean, Bulgakov has like volumes and volumes of systematic theology that are developed around his Sophiology. But I still think it's like, even though, like, it's just, I still think it's not fully systematic though. And you
right.
can see
It's sort
that.
of apophatic. It's sort of like I know Sophia has to be acting here because it's that space between. I like it's like he draws the edges of what
But yeah,
the
at the
dogmas
same
of the
time,
church.
he's willing to go, like, he's willing to do a lot of cataphatic assertion about, like, how are we to understand this at
Yeah,
the same time,
yeah,
quite boldly and audaciously, which is what gets him into trouble. But I think he's right.
yeah. There's a bit from I wanted to read about his. This
Go
is
for
from
it.
his when he's talking about being in his own suffering
Oh
and sort
yeah.
of having this experience of the suffering of Christ at the same time. And he says he was able to help me in my suffering and in my dying only by co-suffering and dying with me. I saw this image with my inner vision. I felt him as Holbein, and Holbein's a reference to this artist that had done a picture of the dying Christ. I felt him as Holbein had felt him, and Dostoevsky after him in his terrible image of the death of Christ, which communicates to us not death, however, but rather dying, not the power of a posthumous transfiguration concomitant with resurrection and on the path towards it, but instead a death that is frozen and halted in the process of dying. Now, you had recently, I'd heard you make some comments about this distinguishing between death and dying. So I'm curious
Yeah, he does it in this essay,
what
right?
you
Where
hear
he's
when,
like, and actually the two different, like, and he's the two different experiences he's recounting. One is of dying, which is of of like the withdrawal, right?
Hmm.
The the with and um the hiding away of God, right?
Yep.
And the other is of uh, of 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 seeing like death as a gateway to life. So he's seeing, and he's saying this is what, in these two experiences, he's saying this is what dying is like,
Yeah.
right? So this is like this is what it's like in the moment when Christ is crying out, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Like there's no putting a beautiful face on that.
Yeah.
Like, well, there is ultimately, but only because of what it accomplishes. But it's like there's no like, I mean, even Christ wanted to avoid it if possible, right? It's there's something like it it just has to be faced. It has to be born, and it is, there's no bright side to it. Like you can't see beyond the threshold yet.
Yeah.
So this is the dying experience. But then when he talks about like the experience of death, like where you actually like have a foretaste of the entrance into eternal life, like that's different. And this resonated with me because like through my own near death, I mean, I didn't actually clinically die, but I had an experience where like I understand exactly what he's talking about because I had an experience when I was a teenager where I went through both of those movements where it's like and it was the same. He talked about how horrible the suffocating was and how it was like that was the worst thing he endured. Well, this was a respiratory arrest.
Yeah.
So I had it was that same like literal physical suffocating sensation. And it's like, and I'm fighting and I don't, and I'm like, you know, I'm crying out to God, like, don't let me die. Like, where are you? And then I come to this, like, I get on the, finally, like, right before the paramedics arrive, I get on the other side of that where it's like, I can see death, right? So like the dying process is like winding down, and it's like, oh, I'm truly going to die. And at the moment that I like accepted that I was going to die and there was nothing to be done about it, and I had to go through it, all of a sudden I just had this feeling of like, oh, I'm going to die. It's okay.
Yeah.
Everything will be all right. And so I didn't have anywhere near the level of full mystical experience that he had, but I
Yeah.
can't. But in terms of those two distinct feelings of like the dying and death, that I was able to understand and to know what he was talking about from my own experience.
So when you read through this and he talks about the sense that in the, well, he says it both ways. He says it kind of in the universal when he's making his logical argument, but he also makes it particular in relaying this personal story of
Right.
his, that the in every human death Christ is present
Christ
with
is
it.
there co-suffering. Yeah.
Did you feel like you did something of that resonate with you in terms of your own experience, in terms of like the peace you felt, the sense of tranquility? Was it a sense of like, 'cause here's the funny thing, like,
Well, it was a warmth. It was a feeling of warmth, and then just like, yeah, it was just like a feeling of like warmth and peace. Like
yeah.
it was almost as if someone was telling me. I wouldn't say that I heard an audible voice, but it's definitely like something from inside, something inside of me was telling me it will be okay.
Hmm.
You can let go.
Yeah.
And this is, I think, well, and this is like, that's what it is like it's the final letting go. So basically the dying is like I started to say, like he explains this like in the chapter. It's like the dying is associated with like that moment of crying out, right? My God, what? Like it's a hopeless experience. Like even Christ in that moment, like 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 the Holy Spirit, like is no longer upon him, right? So like there's a kenosis of the divine within him, that it kind of withdraws from him in that moment. But then at the dying is, it is finished. So it has that resolution,
Yeah.
that realizing that, okay, this has accomplished something, it has meaning, and it's not the end.
Yeah.
It's actually the beginning, because it's affirming what is finished. It's the creation. That's what's finished.
Yeah. It's, I think, in any real, because something about this made me think too, in relationship to suffering, like there's something about suffering, in as much as it's real suffering, always has this sort of portent of death. Like there's
Yeah.
and what I mean by that, I guess, is it's because the awfulness of death isn't just the end of life. It is this sense of this sort of bad thing happening, but also that bad thing somehow being emblematic, symbolic of some sort of finality of a judgment of failure on your part, like of an
Right.
ultimate rejection of.
Well, it's the ultimate, right, and it's the ultimate rejection of your trying to possess, because it's like the one thing you're most possessive of, your life,
Mhm.
you have no power over over it at all. It's just taken from you, and you have no power over that. So it's like it is dying that forces you to surrender. And we can learn to do this. We can actually learn to do this before we actually die. And I think that having, like, it certainly helps having the kinds of experiences that Bulgakov had and that I had. But I think that, like, there are practices, and I think asceticism is important here. And I don't think it I think we can make too much of asceticism, and we can overemphasize asceticism, and asceticism itself can be an idol, especially when it becomes about the asceticism. Like, the asceticism has to be like, what asceticism has to actually be about and be trying to accomplish is that my life is no longer identified with this limited manifestation, this limited embodied existence only. Like, this is not all my life is. My life is tied to something that transcends that.
Yeah.
And so I don't need
And,
to I don't in order to live, I don't need to possessively cling to this.
right. What and for Bulgakov, that linking of his own life with some larger reality in this particular case is for him an experience of God co-suffering and co-dying with him. And
Right. And he talks about that part where he experiences his I as a we too. And like, that's like, to me, that's like, I mean, that's part of it here, is like, we're not we're not a collective, but we are a multi-unity,
mhm,
just as God is a multi-unity. Like, we are all in this together. And which is why, and Bulgakov is very clear in this chapter that, like what Christ accomplishes, he accomplishes in his humanity, which is which is why conquering death by death was the thing that needed to happen,
right.
because that was the only way to affirm the human freedom that God gave to human beings.
Yeah, and I think, well, at least for me, I mean, when I conceptualize this, I think what ultimately the fear that grips me when I think about moments like this, or when I think about past experiences that where some suffering got a hold of me and had this sort of outsized effect or influence on my psychology, and it's always that sort of that fear of ultimate rejection, right? And I think what Bogokov is experiencing here is a tangible, felt sense of connection, so that it doesn't get rid of this sort of veil of rejection and suffering in abandonment. He uses that word abandonment over and over again throughout the text. He doesn't get rid of that, but there's a sense that he has the felt sense that he's experiencing the exact same thing Christ did, and in that way, it's redeemed. It's already glorified in some sense, even though it's a sort of a dim shadow of that larger reality. The fact that he's participating with it in some small way with his little experience, like there's this felt sense of connection, such that the shame, the sense of rejection and abandonment that is encapsulated in this. Because the interesting thing that he points out is that, in the on the cross, there's a sort of work that all of the Trinity has to take part in to
Yeah.
accomplish it, right? The in a certain sense, it's not possible for Christ to die absent this abandonment, and that, so the Father is making this move, that it's sort of a willed passivity towards sustaining of the Son, and there's the Spirit plays its role as well, and there's all this concerted motion to make what seems impossible for the God-man death to be possible, so that he can, voluntarily walk through it. And he does voluntarily walk through it, in terms of, like, at the end he says, "Into your hands I commit my spirit." Like there's a voluntary component at every step of the way. But that Bulgakov makes the point that same act of participation with the divine happens for every human death. That at
Right.
every human death there's a certain
Well, because
willful.
we couldn't die if there
Yeah.
wasn't right. If there wasn't like if there wasn't a withdrawal of the divine, right?
Mhm.
If there wasn't a divine kenosis in death, death couldn't occur.
Yeah, exactly.
Which means if you don't think death costs God something, boy, obviously it does. Because God is with you in that.
Right.
Not
Which
he's
is
it's
so
not all
contrary.
because Christ's humanity is our humanity, and what he does in the shared humanity. So God in Christ is with us, with each person in that moment, and does have to withdraw in order for the death to actually occur, because you'd have, I mean, if there were no withdrawal of the divine within you, then you couldn't, there'd be no way for you to die.
Yeah. Well, and I think, that is completely contrary to the prevailing materialist deist perspective that is, I think, prevalent in the West, where even for those who profess faith, don't necessarily see that God acts to actually do something to participate in their death. That, like,
Right.
well, it's just.
They place death in nature.
Yeah.
Whereas I would say that the Orthodox tradition in general, and certainly Bulgakov, would say that death is something that is, and that is a subversion of nature.
Mhm.
And it's death and sin, which are both subversions of nature, that are being eliminated, or well, yeah, that are being eliminated in the act of Christ on the cross.
Yeah.
He says some interesting things about the like how about like Christ in connection to like illness and illnesses associated with sin, toward the back end of the chapter.
I don't
Did
remember
you
that,
notice
but
that?
yeah, I'm curious that. Yeah. What
Oh,
caught your eye there?
well, he was contemplating the suffering servant passage of Isaiah, where it specifically talks about the suffering servant bearing all illnesses, and it's like he's like no, Christ did not empirically bear every single illness in its particularity, but he bears illness as such, and he includes on that, like he includes spiritual sickness and sin as part of like the illness that is born.
I do remember that. That was interesting. He did, and I do remember also recall that at the beginning of the chapter, he makes a point to say he quotes the Book of Wisdom in saying, "quote God did not create death."
Right.
Wisdom 1:13, but
Right.
merely permitted it.
Yeah.
But
And 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 like the question is what the question is why. And I would say that it's because it's as a mercy. It's for keeping us from becoming locked in our separated state.
yeah,
Because going through the process of death is going to is going to it's going to break you of your like your 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 false attempt to like self-posit an existence that's completely independent of God.
yeah, yeah. It's where, yeah, it's really where the rubber meets the road.
This is why I kind of like, it's interesting. It's like that's why I still kind of like Fight Club, despite its despite its like overly optimistic, cheerful nihilism. Because it does in trying to push that message of like the inevitability of death and the false identification of self with materiality. I think it does like help some people at least get further away from materiality, if nothing else.
Yeah. There's another passage I want to quote. This is from him. Is from him his personal reflection as well, talking about this dying death distinction. He says, "But along with this, there was another thought that up to that point I had not known, and that constituted for me a genuine spiritual event, which will forever remain for me a revelation, not of death, but of dying, with God and in God. It was my dying, with Christ and in Christ. I was dying in Christ, and Christ was dying with me and in me. Such was the terrible and shocking revelation that at that point I most likely could not have been able to express in words and concepts, and that I came to recognize only later. Only one temporally incalculable moment passed between why have you abandoned me, Matthew 27:46, and he gave up the spirit, Matthew 27:50, between the dying of Christ in his divine abandonment and his death. But this moment contains the non-temporal extension and fullness of dying for each person insofar as he dies by it and in it. For no man can die except through divine abandonment. And the same was true for the all man, the new Adam, in the God man. And that's
Right.
that's
That necessarily follows though, right? Because if you have like if there's any like because the divine is life itself.
mhm,
Like to suggest that like and each of us contains each of us contains an element of the divine. This is obvious from Genesis, and I know we both agree with that, so there's no point to argue about it now. I'm sure some people that would not agree with that, but they're wrong, and I would be happy to demonstrate otherwise. But in any case, it's because the divine is life itself. If the divine doesn't withdraw, no death can occur.
yeah, that makes sense. And again, it's interesting. Well, I mean, of course, that makes. I mean, that's just obvious, right? But what's funny for me is
What's different with what Christ does is Christ is laying aside, so he's laying aside his divinity, that which is life itself and
mhm,
divinity itself, which is
voluntarily.
the second highest, yeah, voluntarily sets it aside. So he voluntarily sets it aside, and then And his voluntary setting aside is what opens it for that, for that, for that, for the kenotic action within the Trinity to withdraw from him.
Right. Yeah.
And if we can, here's the tricky bit. If we can, if we can manage that same willful letting go, you can start to be, you can really transform your life right now. Like right now, if you, I mean, like, if it's like, if you can like truly let go of like possessing life as my life and be willing to just let it go in that way, then that's transformative.
Yeah. I absolutely agree. I'm curious, one of the things that we've chatted about recently, on the Boxer thread was this idea of eros. And I'm curious, it seems like there's some sort of connection between eros and death in terms of like, the culmination of erotic love, being referred to as this little death, and all these sort of and I'm curious what you think about what the connection between this drawing towards that ultimately culminates in death.
Well, yeah, I don't know. I'd have to think about that.
Yeah.
I'd have to think about that. I don't have a good answer for that. That is a really, really good question though. Well, let me see here. I so to me, like, the only thing I can think of is, well, so to me, eros is desire, right? And it's like a redeemed eros is a desire which is directed
Is the
toward.
desire secondary or is it primary in eros? Because for me, at least how I conceptualize, and this could be completely backwards, I conceptualize it, so I locate it in human consciousness and attention first and foremost. This sort of man, I don't even know how to describe it, but obviously, what you identify it with beauty, which is this sort of ineffable manifestation of the true,
Right,
the
but
good, the
the
beautiful.
beauty is the desired, not the desirer, right? So like like it is the beauty, like it is the beautiful, which is really, I mean, the beautiful as such is one with the good and the true, right?
Mhm.
So if you're actually like if you're desiring beauty as, such, you're desiring God, which is that, which is what the aim of a redeemed eros is, which means that your desire is not caught up with any of the accidents of your material embodiment. So you can actually let go of those things. So a redeemed eros is actually completely detached from the passions, as
Mhm.
ironic as that is, even though it's still a desire. But it's a desire that wants to know only God as its object.
Is the right word detached, or like I've heard this word sublimation? Is that because it's funny, like I remember I
No,
remember.
detached is probably the wrong word. I mean, you're detached from, the lesser goods that can misdirect your desire,
Mhm,
right?
mhm.
I, which is what idolatry is, right? Idolatry is the turning of desire toward something that is a lesser good, and you
Mhm.
can, right, as opposed to the proper object of desire, which is God, the beautiful as such, the good as such, the
Yeah.
true as such. So
Well, I guess I
um
say that because I feel like
so
in
you're very much you're entering into communion with those things, so that's an attachment, right? But you're detaching from those lesser attachments. So
Mhm.
it's actually involves both attachment and there's a move of detachment from the lesser goods, detachment from the movements of your passions, and attachment to the source of the reason you have desire at all.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, there's that I was thinking of that famous scene in The Great Divorce where the guy has this like little wheat thing on his
Yeah,
back that he
right.
has to have the angel
Yeah,
kill it for him, and
right,
it's representative of his lust. But
right,
as soon as he willfully submits it to death, it like turns into this horse that
right.
he
Yeah,
rides.
exactly. Yeah, we have yes, exactly. So this is so I see what you're saying now. Yeah, so it is like it's death. Like that's like, if you want to think of it as like it is a death of a sort, like a little death, like you were suggesting. Um, but what you're dying to is those little broken possessive desires
Mhm.
that want to just have the object for yourself.
Yeah. Wait, I bristled a little against detached because I feel like it felt too akin to conceptions I think I still have inside of me of all these things as being bad and negative that like
No,
that they
right.
have to be kind of cast away where I'm
No, it's like you
trying.
can still use that. Here's the thing. That's the thing,
Yeah.
though. It's like I don't know. I don't have a better word from when I say detachment. I don't mean
Yeah.
like I mean you're not invested in them anymore.
Yeah.
So you can still use them. So it's like you still need to eat, right? You still need to drink. You still have bodily needs that you have to take care of. You can't just live in a state of like, constant meditation, right? So you still have bodily needs that you need to take care of, but you
Hmm.
just don't you're no longer symbiotic. Let's say like what we have when we're disordered is like a sort of a symbiotic attachment to those desires where
Yeah.
we allow them to direct us. So the key is to, like, it's easy to talk about and hard to do, right?
Yeah.
But the idea is that you don't let yourself be um attached to them. There really isn't, like, I don't think there's a better word. You really, like, you can be detached from something and still like realize that it's necessary. It's just that you don't feel like you have a lot. There's not like, okay, it's like, okay, so I have to eat, so I eat, you know, and you can still, I mean, and that doesn't mean that you can't still eat joyfully and take pleasure in food and gather together with friends for communion. Uh,
Yeah.
so um, yeah,
So I have like 7 minutes left before I gotta head. But
all right. What do you want?
I had I had one, obviously, you know, we've talked about this before, but like this issue of divine impassibility is something that I always am kind of bumping up against
Right.
just because it feels very contrary to certain intuitions I've had.
Yeah.
Um and and so I'm curious, and I know for you've expressed previously a desire to like kind of have have some sort of dialogue between um process theology and classical theism,
Hmm.
to get those things to talk to each other. Was there anything in this essay that you felt like helped
Yeah,
make that bridge more?
I would say so. I would say that, like, there. Okay. Well, Bulgakov doesn't talk about this. This is more my own idea. But I would
Mhm.
say let's talk about it from the sake of what Bulgakov is suggesting. I think is that in the Passion of Christ, I think that I don't see how that, like, the impassibility, I think, is it might be related to the kenotic withdrawal, possibly, but that means to be a stretch. As far as I can tell, I think he's suggesting that the Passion of Christ, like, if there ever was divine impassibility, it's no longer there. Like, God has thrown his chips in with us. He's become one of us. Like, that's no longer, like, divinity and humanity have been joined. And at least in this essay, I don't see any evidence. And he's Orthodox, so I'm sure he would have some conception of impassibility. And I think which is why I offered it may be related to that withdrawal, that kenotic withdrawal part. But to me, like, it has to do with the way I've been thinking about it lately is along the lines of, like, manifested and unmanifested. So, like,
Are you referring to the already not yet aspects of the gospel itself when you
no,
say
what I'm
that?
suggesting is what I'm suggesting is something about the structure of our own the structure of our own humanity, and the structure of the triune Godhead. I think that, like, the the way we experience God in the world
Mhm.
is through, like, the relational operations of the Trinity.
Right.
God is love. But I think that, like, and just as, like, like what we are also as persons is fundamentally, it's a relational consciousness. And yet there's something about us that is still remains unmanifest, and we are self-transcendent.
Right.
And I think and you have the same structure in God. So I think that part of God that, and yeah, you can't say part. You're, but that, let's say there remains something of Godness, which is unmanifested in its full infinity.
Right.
That is that is
That's the impassable part.
that's the impassable part.
Okay.
And that the way we have been shown to know God and relate to God as human beings is through Christ.
Could
And that is
could
done through our humanity, and is the gateway to the proper mode of our participation in divinity through sharing that divine humanity of Christ, which is our telos.
right.
And I
Yeah,
think
that's
that
interesting.
I really think that if you hold to epixtasis as, like, your conception of the eschaton, I think that almost necessarily has to be true, because there always has to be something. There always has to be something calling you ever further,
Yeah.
right? So there
Well,
always
but
has
here
to
here
be.
well, I guess my
Go
question
ahead.
though is in this divine joining between us and God, are we the only ones that are altered by that, or is
That's
there
a
some alteration in the divine story as well?
well, I yeah, that's I mean that's like that's like that is a great question, and I think that's like
Because the reason I asked that, because, like, I think maybe this is me just being petulant or dogmatic, but I feel like you
no.
can't really say that that union is real if it's not having two-way effects.
Oh, for sure. I'm not, but it's through but the effects are through the manifested the relational manifestation is where that is. And
Yeah.
it's in God's relation to the creation, our relation, like it's in the relations that it is, but there's still like there's something about God that is not exhausted by the relations, just as there's something about
Right.
us.
Right.
And that actually allows for that ever continuing evolution.
Yeah. Let me see what you think of this. Like, so like, have you ever heard of well, I can't remember the guy, Stephen Wolfram, and his conception, his kind of theory of everything? Have you ever listened to any of his stuff?
I think maybe briefly.
Wait, he talks about these like very, very simple rules that kind of can be built up into like a theory of everything.
Mhm.
And so it makes me wonder if there couldn't be, in some sense, there's some basic essence of what God is, similar to that quote unquote simple rule, whatever you want to call it, that is forever the same, and yet it is still the substrate that is making something new, whereby it is sort of making the blank piece of paper that we are able to write on, even though our story is so much relatively diminutive in size relative to the divine story, but yet still makes a real tangible mark on the divine story that like is sort of like um yeah, that is indelible on the divine
Well, there's
person.
definitely like, I mean, a lot of people see Bulgakov as actually having been influential on some process theologians, and there's definitely
Yeah.
like there's something like he's definitely affirming a radical freedom, which is funny, which is funny because he's also a solid universalist for equally like strong, profound reasons. But at the same time, he is seeing there being a radical freedom in creation.
Yeah.
You know, and he says things like in that chapter, like he doesn't think that like it was necessarily like an impossibility for Herod to have succeeded in
Yeah.
killing
Yeah.
the infant Christ.
Yeah.
Right? It's like it wasn't a
Actions
foregone
had to be
conclusion.
taken. Yeah.
Right? Actions had to be taken. Things had to be done. There are things
Yeah.
still have to be accomplished. Like that's and yeah. What does he say? I always say being and becoming, and he says in this essay he says something about fullness and becoming, which is better.
Yeah.
Which is better because fullness still allows for that. The reason fullness is better because it allows for you to. I like it better than either being, which is confusing because most people in modernity have a univocal definition of being. I like it better than being, and I like it better than beyond being. Beyond being just sounds pointlessly mystical,
Yeah.
but fullness, keeping in mind that God is the infinite, this ties into this concept that I was talking about. There always remaining
Right.
something of God which is not manifest.
Right.
So if you've seen, if you've seen Christ, you've seen God. I mean, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. It's
Yeah.
true. But at the same time, if our eschatology actually looks like further up and further in, then you ain't seen nothing yet.
Oh yeah.
It's
Yeah.
also true at the same time.
I like that. But on that note, I actually have to step out. My
Yeah, yeah. I knew you
my
had
Uber's
a
about to
hard
be
stop
here.
time. Yeah.
But
Okay.
yeah, this was
Yeah.
great, and I'd love to
Okay.
pick it up again.
Okay.
And really
Yeah.
appreciate the time.
We can definitely do another one.
Awesome.